Right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Ask Me Anything session with Dan Maron. Dan co-authored a book in 2010, which is called The Crowdfunding Revolution, along with Kevin Lawton. He's an expert in finance. He advises the World Bank and the European Commission. He works with corporates and with a number of people that are involved, not just in the startup field, but in the corporate world more generally. And he's also recently published his new book, which is about crowdfunding in the corporate era. So it'd be really interesting to hear a little about that at the end. So Dan, over to you. We've got a list of very, very interesting questions from you, and we've got a chat that's open at the same time as you speak. So I'm sure that there'll be a number of other contributions that will be requesting your input over this hour. So thanks very much, Dan. Over to you.
Thank you. First of all, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here, and I'm really delighted. Thanks for the opportunity. I think that IoT can benefit much, generally saying, from the crowdfunding revolution, and I'd be more than happy not only to spend the next hour together, but also to be instrumental in the future for the startups that are participating in the program. Generally saying, crowdfunding is about gathering small amounts of money from a large crowd, and we can divide it into four main mechanisms. The first is donation, the second is reward, the third is equity, and the fourth is debt. So when we generally speak about crowdfunding, it has much to do with the underlying mechanism of what's the return on investment for the investor. What's the way that we are getting back the investment? I think that all the four of them, or at least the three of them, which is donation for nonprofits who are doing IoT, and I'm still not familiar with the startups, but if there are some tech impact ventures that would like to change the world with wearables or other instruments that are targeting for emerging countries, donation can be relevant. Reward, I think it's the most popular one, where we have Indiegogo, Kickstarter campaigns, where we pre-sell or pre-purchase a specific product. In IoT, as much as I can tell, and yet I'm not familiar with the startups and I'd love to hear more, for tangible projects, it's very, very common to have a reward-based crowdfunding campaign, where a few months ahead of delivering the product, you could sell it to potential backers and then fund your venture. And last, equity-based crowdfunding. In many countries in Europe, currently it's legal to fundraise and to sell shares in your startup to the public. And in many countries, there are platforms which are currently operating that enables you to sell shares of your company. And that's the third, I think, mechanism that could be relevant. I'd love to think more about the fourth one, the debt-based peer-to-peer lending, whether it's appropriate. Currently, it seems less relevant, but hopefully I can learn something new, less relevant to the IoT world. Sorry, I forgot to mention, we're doing this interview in an Israeli way, and I'm terribly sorry for that. I got stuck in the road and I'm doing it from my car, so hopefully you can hear me well, and you can see a bit of Israel in the back of me.
Well, on that, Dan, I think that the only thing we can see is the back of your car. So
okay.
At some stage you can swivel it round and we can be very jealous at the sunset that probably is going on behind you. If I just crack on then, we've got loads of questions for you, as I say, and we're expecting to have quite a few through the chat as we progress through this interview, this AMA. But the first thing, and I think it's a very relevant approach for all of our startups, is what are the main factors to consider when deciding if crowdfunding is actually a suitable approach for your product or service?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. It depends on the mechanism that we're discussing, because crowdfunding is a general word for several ways to fund your venture. I guess that the question is addressing the reward-based crowdfunding. Always when we speak about crowdfunding, usually people refer to that mechanism, Kickstarter and Indiegogo, just as an example, and there are hundreds of other platforms that allows reward-based crowdfunding to be done, and campaigns can be done in local and global platforms. I'm not familiar with platforms which are specializing in IoT, but I know that there are some that specializes in hardware and might be relevant to consider platforms that are more suitable for such products. What should be considered is the status of the venture and the readiness for such a campaign. The crowd has no expertise in IoT or in any other technology-related issues. So the product should be very tangible. We should have the ability to explain it very clearly in a few minutes, several minutes. Usually it's been done via video. So the readiness for crowdfunding is actually the ability to sell the idea, to have a pitch to a crowd, to an unsophisticated crowd, which means that we can have in 3 or 4 months to deliver the product, usually. We need to have it ready, the sketches or the plans, the pricing, the features, etc. So for reward-based crowdfunding, we should be very close to the market usually. And that's the readiness. Besides that, there are a few elements that should be prepared for such a campaign, such as video, text, images, etc. And that's a strategy of campaign building. I'd love to share with you later on a few checklists that I've prepared that might be relevant for those who are considering such a campaign, and I think that could find it instrumental.
Well, absolutely. In fact, I know that I had a sneak preview at some of the questions that we were sent in advance of this AMA, and one of them does, in fact, refer to techniques and tactics for that. So that'd be really pertinent for the purposes of today. So next question, it's actually just it's a very legal question. Does a startup need to be a legal entity to run a crowdfunding campaign?
Well, I'm not a legal expert, and you should consult one in your country or in your region. As far as I know, in order to conduct a campaign, you need to get paid. Either it's for rewards that you're selling items or you're selling shares. So usually you need to be registered as an entity, a legal entity, in the country that you're fundraising for. It's important in crowdfunding to notice that mainly in equity-based crowdfunding, the legal issues are far more concerning due to the ability in the region to fundraise from the crowd, and more legal readiness or preparedness should be made upon starting such a campaign.
Well, that's very good advice, and I'm sure those of our startups who are considering crowdfunding as a fundraising mechanism will take that on board. The next question: how important is offline as opposed to online marketing? I think they're referring to the difference between physical events as opposed to having a tactic or a campaign strategy that is purely online.
The synergy between offline and online is extremely important. And generally saying, we are starting from the core believers that should be family, friends, people who are exposed to our venture. Usually, I'm suggesting having a pre-lunch or having a soft lunch where you prepare for several weeks the ground. It should be with media, it should be with family and friends, it should be with your first circle of potential backers. That should be done offline mostly. Later on, having a plan of online events and advertisements is extremely important, as the physical meetings with potential backers can have a huge impact on the decision to support, but not only to back the project, but to be hopefully the ambassadors of your venture. And therefore, I think that in the few months of the campaign, during the campaign, it's extremely important to combine these both in order to have a very effective campaign. These both meaning having a party to launch officially the campaign, a physical one, having a tour of lectures or meetings with relevant backers, convincing people to be ambassadors, not only to back your project, but to be a hub for others. And therefore, physical or offline and online has a combination could be very powerful.
Well, thank you for that. That's extremely interesting. I think most of us think of Kickstarter and Indiegogo as the crowdfunding campaign itself, but actually what you're saying is that that's probably just the end point. What you do before that is probably as important as what you finally put up on the page itself. You need to do a lot of preparation.
Definitely. Prior to the campaign, during the campaign, and after the campaign, it's a full-time job to have a crowdfunding campaign. It requires planning, it requires execution, it requires thinking about how we can converge people who are generally interested into backers and how to converge them into believers and ambassadors, because we'd like to spread the word and we need backers to support us. So, and I think that generally saying, crowdfunding is all about creating a community, and it's much more than money. And I think that what should considered is the added value that comes out of a crowdfunding campaign. It's not only the X euro or dollar that would be fundraised, hopefully successfully during the campaign, but creating a community that has many different added values on top of the capital. And I think that the community for IoT, for example, because you need users, you need samples, you need data from them, etc. Building a community can serve startups sometimes even more than capital.
That's very interesting, actually, and we'll be talking more about that, I think, as we progress and throughout, in fact, the whole of the acceleration period here in Startup Scale Up. What do you think is the key method to bring customers to campaigns? Paid leads, Facebook, or Jellup? I don't know what Jellup is, actually. So, do you know what Jellup is?
No.
Okay.
But I'm learning every day something new.
Okay.
So I can comment about the one that I'm not familiar with. It's hard to tell. It depends on the project. It depends on the target audience. It depends on the way to bring them. I think that what's more important is the message than the media itself. And if I understood correctly, the question is about the media. I think that what should be considered is the message. And the message could be, we can save the world, something altruistic. It could be something emotional. It could be something very functional. What's in it for me? And I think that a good message combines these all. Regarding the media itself, it has to do with the target audience, because one of the first steps, and I'll send it in the checklist or in the roadmap that I prepared for successful projects, one of the first steps is identifying the right target market. And after you identify the target market, should be the potential backers, now you should approach them with the right media. Some of them, in some places, in some niches or in some segments, one media could be more instrumental, and others the other one. And for the question, besides answering, there was a very famous Israeli politician who always got questions from the media, and he was starting with his answer with, I'll ask the question and afterward I'll answer. So I feel that I'm doing the same. The question about the media is first the question about the target audience, then the question about the message, and last, the question about the media itself.
Okay, so first message, second target.
Yes,
audience,
target market,
and
message,
third media.
And third media, and they should work together, these three.
Perfect. Okay, so coming back to Maurice, one of our partners from Crowdfund, has asked, referring to what we were discussing earlier, should you really let family members invest in your company? I think that's a good question, actually.
It's definitely a good question. I must apologize that I don't see the chat. So if there's something important, please let me know. So sorry for that. It's a very, very good question. In Israel, our rest day is Saturday, and usually we are having family dinners on Friday. So when I'm speaking to colleagues or students, I'm telling them that raising money from family and friends, meaning speaking about business in Friday dinner, and you could get all sorts of troubles. Um, that's for sure. That's the downside. The fact is that you need to create the first core believers. And most of the time, it's the family and friends or people who are previously familiar with you and with your idea. I know it has some downsides, but I think that spreading the word, leveraging social network, and definitely some of it has to do with family, is a core aspect in spreading out the word. And I think that it's essential. I do humbly suggest that do no harm and do no fraud. And if you are not succeeding, do it with honor and faithfully, and therefore family wouldn't be upset. But I think that it's a necessary element of each campaign.
That's a very good maxim, actually. You're making basically your family keep you honest. So it's probably a good rule for everything you do in life, not just crowdfunding.
Definitely.
Okay, so a couple of questions from companies that are looking at US markets, actually. What would you see as the difference between crowdfunding in the US versus Europe?
Well, it's a hard question. It depends on whether we're talking about reward or equity. It has legal issues with it, etc. Let's start with the reward-based crowdfunding. I don't see actually much of a difference. I think that the question should be, where is the target market, as we talked before. If the target market, the majority of the target market resides in a specific geographic, the campaign should be there. If the afterward, some other issues should be considered, but first and foremost, it's the strategy of finding out where is the target market and how can we approach them perfectly. There are some technicalities regarding a few other mechanisms that are a bit more complicated, such as debt and equity, that offer some differences between the nations. But I don't feel that for the basic parts of crowdfunding there's a much of a change, and it's the same for any other geography.
Okay, so this links into the next question, which is, do you have any specific recommendations for kickstarting a product in the USA from Spain? Now, you already mentioned that you should, it depends on your target market. In the case of this startup, their target market is probably going to be California, etc. So it makes sense to them. But if they're doing that from here, from Spain, is there anything that they should take into account, apart from the time difference, clearly?
And the language.
And the language.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, California, yeah.
I think that the best advice is to start building your community now, much before starting the crowdfunding campaign. The crowdfunding campaign is one piece of the journey, and I think the journey should start now. If you're considering a crowdfunding campaign and you know the target audience, start building the community as from 30 or 40 minutes from now, due to the fact that that's the most important asset, the crowd or the community, the most important asset in the future crowdfunding campaign. And if you're going to a different geography where you don't have contact supporters or prior knowledge, building a community is even more crucial. So if you're doing it in another continent, in another country, you should build the infrastructure of backers, of media, bloggers, social networks, knowing the language, not the technical parts of the language, but the way that business is done there exactly. And I'm not referring now to Spain and the US. It's if you want to do a crowdfunding campaign outside of your um, of your home playground. I think that after the understanding of the need to build a community, I think that other infrastructure should be taken care of, and that's of course understanding how the message should be conveyed in the specific target market. What are the priorities for the target market, etc. So a lot of preparations should be made if you're not doing it back at home.
Thank you. In fact, I think a lot of the things you said there refer to or are easily as relevant if you're doing your campaign in your home time. Things like build your community now. I mean, that's never going to be a bad thing, whatever you do, whether you do it here or you do it somewhere else. So definitely good advice, I think, for everyone. Do you, okay, yeah. Indiegogo versus Kickstarter, and the startup that's put this said, please be opinionated. So take a stance.
Actually, they are both very good. I think that one that considers having a crowdfunding campaign on each should learn the previous ones that have been done on the same platform, should see whether the target market and in the niche or domain that the venture operates has some kind of an advantage in one platform on another. It has to do also, some of the platforms offer different rules, such as the origin of the entrepreneur, transferring money, etc. Rules should be watched out previous to making a decision. So I think it's a combination of understanding the target market, again, learning from past experience on these specific platforms, and understanding the rules that regards the specific campaign. And I would make a decision based upon these parameters.
That's very practical advice there. So from another startup, when researching for our crowdfunding campaign, we found a significant number of projects that after a successful campaign failed to deliver. What are your thoughts on this problem?
Well, it's a good question. I think that in cultures that embrace entrepreneurship, failure is not banned. Entrepreneurs that have failed, we understand that they are part of the entrepreneurial journey, and we should embrace failure and learn from it. So generally speaking, I think, for example, in Israel, I think that serial entrepreneurs, even the ones that failed before, are considered heroes in a sense, and not only ones that succeeded. And I know that in other countries, it's the other way around. Now, regarding the question itself,
Dan, we lost you there for a moment. So regarding the question itself, that was where you left off.
Regarding the question itself, I think that people are taking risks, backers are taking risks while they are backing a project and not buying something that exists in eBay or Amazon. And I think that risk should be considered. Usually when you go to reward-based campaigns, most of them deliver, even if it's not on time, even if it's delayed, because they are quite mature. One of the readiness aspects is to have a product that will be ready in a few months, and most of the risk is already not there. I think that as an entrepreneur, you should do as much as you can in order to evaluate the risks, to do the right pricing, because some may not take into account buffers or taking things that you think won't happen, usually, as Murphy suggested, will happen during this process. So I think that if the project is the units or the rewards or the perks are priced accordingly, I think that such failures could be minimized. So as an entrepreneur, planning ahead is extremely important, and sometimes getting so many purchases could be an issue, and therefore planning ahead could minimize such cases.
Perfect. What about, I mean, that was really, I suppose, it wasn't exactly fraud, but that was something that that occurs, or the question was around something that occurs when the startup itself doesn't deliver the product it promises. Is there any, or have there been any cases of fraud the other way around? So backers who have committed to something and then maybe not delivered their end, or does that not happen?
Well, it's an interesting question. I haven't thought about it yet, so I need to improvise. I think that most cases in reward-based crowdfunding, payment has been done by credit cards, and payment is quite secured. And also, because you have a crowd of investors, a lot of investors that put small amounts, usually, even if such a very extreme case will happen, I guess it will have a minor effect because it's small amounts that gather into a substantial one. So I'm not familiar with such cases. I need to think more in depth about the possibility of having such kind of a case, but I think it's quite minor. If I understood correctly the question.
I think so. I'm not quite sure because I'm just reading it off the chat, but I think that's perfect for what we needed to know.
The one that wrote it is considering to make a fraud, or is thinking how to prevent one?
Well, it says it's I think it's actually one of the startup scale-up staff. So it'd be interesting to find out because I can't really tell from the chat whether it's it doesn't have the surname. But anyway, I'll do some investigating afterwards and tell you offline who it was that asked and why. Okay. So next group of questions: is it possible to crowdfund a B2B to C product that will be used by the public but purchased by professionals?
Yeah, it's a good question that I've been asked many times. Unfortunately, the fact is that B2B products are usually if it's been purchased by businesses, usually it's a much smaller crowd. And therefore, when you think about the target market, about the potential funnel of people who will be interested, and afterward you can converge them to people that might purchase, etc., the funnel itself is quite small, and the population that might buy the product is not big enough. So the question is not about B2B or B2B2C or B2C, it's whether we are really approaching the crowd, or is it a small niche with a small group of people that we should think ahead what's the potential of fundraising from them. Because the same can happen also in B2C if you approach a very, very small niche of end clients. And the answer in one line is usually it's much, much harder to crowdfund, or even it's not relevant to crowdfund for B2B products if they have a small market.
Okay, so there it's basically the key consideration is making sure you actually have something that's directed to the crowd, or the crowd is a potential purchaser of that product or services. If it's a niche product or service, then crowdfunding probably isn't the best mechanism for raising funds.
It would be much harder if the potential target market is very small.
Okay. Right. Are you noticing any new trends in the types of projects reaching their funding goals? That's quite an interesting one.
Can you repeat?
Yes,
can you?
Sure. Are you noticing any new trends in the types of projects reaching their funding goals?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. trends in the successful ones, the ones that are successful in fundraising. The common issues is that they share good planning, execution, etc. They have good marketing skills. Whether I find some trends, I can't think of anything smart that pops out of my head. I need to think about it a bit more.
Okay. In terms of the campaigns themselves, we've got quite a few questions coming in from there. The first one, I mean, you mentioned community a number of times, that it's the basis of a successful campaign. And you've also said that, first of all, it's message, then it's the target audience, and then it's the media. So that also kind of feeds into that. But what other suggestions do you have for building a successful community?
I think that first and foremost is to identify what's the community, who's the typical customer or community member, and trying to find out the elements that the community is built on. And second, which is more important, is how do we create value for this specific community? Not how we can approach them, not how can we fundraise for them, etc., but how we can create a value. I think that if we create a value can be emotional, physical, it could be content, it could be related to ego, it could be related to any other cause or any other motivation. But after we identify the community and the value that it needs, I think these are the keys to a successful way of building such a community. Afterwards, such a community could be leveraged. It could be leveraged into fundraising. You could have a crowdsourcing of new ideas. You could do much more with the community. Imagine that you have 1,000 people working for you as an advisory board or helping you. They can link you to customers, suppliers. They can identify bugs. They can have new ideas for business or anything else that could be relevant for the business. And one of the elements could be crowdfunding, but the crowd power has much more in it than the crowdfunding itself.
That's I'm really glad to hear you say that, because we started the whole acceleration program with IoT as Week. One of the things that I think is particularly important is the customer discovery part of that. You need to go out, you need to understand who your customers are. And what you're saying is, with that knowledge, you can then continue to build upon that and get your crowd. And that can be used in a number of different ways, not just for funding or raising funds, but also for gaining ideas about how to improve your product continuously, how you might be able to reach other other customers, and how you might be able to reach adjacent markets as well. So I'm glad you said that.
Thank you very much. The preparation worked.
Yes, exactly. The however much I slipped under the table. Does the season of the year have any effect on the success of the campaign?
I don't have any data about it, so I can't tell for sure. I guess there are issues of seasonality. I guess sometimes it should be planned around holidays where people are buying gifts, etc. It depends on the campaign. But I don't have any specific insights or data about, unfortunately, about this question.
Okay, I would add something that if you're in Spain, then definitely avoid August, because everyone's somewhere else. So, okay. Yes. Next question: what's the most common mistake that startups make with crowdfunding campaigns?
They think it's easy money, and that's the easiest way to fundraise. While you need a new skill set, a set of skills. You need a new toolbox, and most of all, you need much time in order to plan, prepare, execute, and deliver. And I think that the number one mistake is thinking that you can upload a link or a video like I'm making now, a selfie with your iPhone, and hoping that the crowd will find you among all other thousands of projects that are currently out there, and millions of people will back you. That's a very typical mistake. The fact is, it's quite hard. It requires a lot of resources. It requires focus, and I think that it has many added values, etc. And besides capital, as I mentioned before, but definitely it's not the easiest part, and definitely it requires attention and preparation accordingly.
Okay. Worrate has started to work on crowdfunding campaign with Unilever. How do they decide what goal should be mentioned in the campaign, and how should they calculate it?
So there are tools, and I can share one tool as an example that takes your social network, does a few calculations, and based upon the number of friends, likes, whatever you have, it can calculate the probability of fundraising from X percentage of them, and then getting an assumption about the current ability to fundraise for X. So there are a few tools already doing that.
Well, that would be great if you could share those with us and make sure that that the startup scale-up teams get that, because that'd be brilliant. That's a very practical thing, actually. What are the criteria to set up the period of campaign, and why? And I've got another question there. Is it 60 days, 45 days, or 30 days?
I don't think there's a magic number here. Usually, I tend to suggest a longer period. The downside is you don't have a sense of urgency, because a backer knows that he has 60 days or 50. There are ways to motivate or to incentivize people to back you on the first days, although it's a longer period, like having steps, etc., which is quite common. But I think that spreading out the word, working with the media, making from the first tier of friends and family to other networks that you previously were not familiar with, I think that it takes time, and I suggest to have a longer period. In some cases, we have already a big community, or you have the right infrastructure to do it, you can do it quite easily in 30 days or so. But generally, I suggest a longer period.
So the longer period, but providing incentives for people not to delay, so they come onto the platform and say, okay, there's a reason why I need to put my money down now, rather than wait for 3 months.
Exactly. Giving yourself the freedom of enjoying a longer period, but planting incentives so people will have a sense of urgency to back you now, because you'd like to create a momentum of a successful or winning campaign. That's extremely important. People like, we live in a herd. The people like to eat in a restaurant that's full and not eat in a restaurant that's empty. And it's the same for crowdfunding campaigns. You'd like to join a big group that decided to back this project and to be a part of something which is bigger than you. And therefore, we must motivate people and to plan the right incentives. So even if they'll have 59 days to back you, it's important that they'll do it now, because the first 100 will be with the discount, the next 1,000 will be in a different discount, etc. That's one of the most straightforward tactics. There are more to incentivize people to do it now.
Okay, so we'll look forward to doing a little bit more research on tactics to make sure that people keep that sense of urgency. How far in advance would you suggest announcing the fact that you're going to crowdfund?
At least a month before. Usually prepare to do a month, between 1 to 2 months of preparations, video key messages, understanding the target audience, preparing the rewards, etc., doing the strategy and all the marketing communication, and then at least a month of soft launch or pre-launch, where you are starting to spread the word that you are about to crowdfund, and people will be ready, and you'd like to give the right tools and incentives to people to back you at the starting phase of your campaign. Because as I've said earlier, you'd like to create a momentum, you'd like to create it very early. So at least 4 weeks before you launch the campaign, per your question.
I think that's really interesting. I was in London at a pre-launch, in fact, at a makers community, and they had, you know, beers in crates on ice, and they had Haribo bears everywhere, and there was a really great atmosphere. And one of the techniques they used was asking everyone to sign up to Thunderclap. So when the campaign on Kickstarter was actually launched, they'd get this whole kind of activity on Twitter at the same time saying that the campaign, the Kickstarter, had actually started. Yep. So I imagine there are lots of other techniques, again, for making sure that during that soft launch, you're prepping things for that day one to go really well.
Exactly. It's a very good example. There are some more tactics, but it's extremely important to build the community. And that's, if I understood correctly, that's what this company has done, starting gaining momentum even before starting the campaign, to have data about potential backers. It could be email, it could be like in Facebook, it could be in Twitter, whatever. The way that we could notify them in advance and take them as a part of the journey, hopefully that they will be convinced that they need to help us as well afterward.
Great. A couple of very specific questions, actually. Delivery, should it be included in the price of the product or not?
Usually, when it's done in the US, usually you include the delivery in the US, and outside of US you charge for extra fee. It's important to state it very, very clear, so the crowd or the public won't have any issues with it. So I think that if you're having in a specific region, usually you should include the delivery in the specific region and state that outside of it, there will be a pricing of for each country or for each geography.
Okay, so clarity, whatever option you choose, make sure that it's clear to your backers.
Exactly.
Do you have any advice about how to protect the IP of the product?
That's a very, very common question. The downside is you expose your idea ahead of launching actually the product. I would argue that you could become a leader and you can create an advantage if you state that you're about to start crowdfunding or you're starting the crowdfunding ahead, and it could be helpful regarding potential competition. I know it's a debate, and I know that some entrepreneurs will fear the fact that they will start 4 or 5 months before the launch. I see the advantages as much bigger than the downside, and I think that for most ventures or for most disciplines or domains, it's better to start earlier and to create a positive momentum toward your venture instead of hiding until the last moment.
I think that's very good advice there. Moving on now to the equity platforms or loan raising platforms. Apparently there are a number of them, for example, in Holland and the Netherlands, they're quite popular.
Yep.
How would you determine interest rates? Is there a technique for doing that?
Well, I should think how it can be in the context of IoT, but generally saying, if you're a business, in some platforms, the platform, or in some countries, the platform define it. In other cases, I think it should, if you define it as an entrepreneur, and actually I'm not familiar with the platforms that allows you to do so, but if it can be done, I would start with the target market, understanding what should be attractive for them, comparing it to other asset classes that they have access to, and then defining the right interest rate that will work for them. Starting with the target market, I know I repeated it over and over, but I think it's a very important dimension. Knowing your client, as you said, and understanding it, it's crucial in the entrepreneurial venture journey.
You can say it as many times as you like, Dan, because believe me, I say it every 5 minutes to the lot that I speak to regularly. So I'm really glad that you're saying it. What are the ways to determine the value of a company when you want to fund via the crowd?
Evaluation of private companies or startups, it's more an art than a science. I think for IP-based companies, you don't do evaluation upon future revenues exactly like you do it for other businesses. There are some comparables in the market for seed round, A round, etc. That should be applicable here for the region, the domain, the status of the company, the phase that it has, etc. And I think that should be applied for the startups.
Okay, carrying on with the same type of campaign, what communication channels are mostly used to communicate before the deal, and which channels would you use after the deal?
I guess that popular or mass media, when we say about crowdfunding, when you approach unaccredited investors, mass media is relevant alongside tailored media like approaching them if you have an email newsletter, if you have a specific places that you think your target market will be, etc. Afterward, you have a very, very specific crowd that you are working with, which are your backers, investors. It's much easier. The challenge is not how you notify them about the status of your company, etc., but how you see them and you make them act like they're not only shareholders, passive ones, but they're ambassadors of your brand or your product. And I think that's the real challenge post fundraising or crowdfunding. Having the right incentives, emotional and physical, so that 1,000 people will still back you with capital and with other means, that's a major challenge. It can be done physically, can be done virtually, but it's a must if you'd like to leverage your community assets or your crowd power to your needs.
So once again, it's you're making the point there that crowdfunding isn't just about the funding, it's about harnessing the power of the crowd to act as your ambassador and to basically evangelize for you.
Exactly.
Okay. Which platforms do you suggest? Now, we've got Symbid has been suggested on the chat. Are there any other equity platforms that you have knowledge of and that you think work particularly well?
There are so many equity-based platforms in many countries. I would love to send a guide or a list or directory, as I think each of them offer other added value to the potential entrepreneurs.
Well, thank you very much. We look forward to getting that. Very practical questions. Larry says, thanks for your answer, Dan. I think his question was, how far in advance would you crowdfund? I have one more question. There seems to be more and more agencies specializing in crowdfunding campaigns. Would you recommend running the campaign yourself or hiring an agency?
Well, it's a good question. I think that like any other activity that you outsource as a venture, there are pros in having professionals running your campaign, which they have experience, they have the time and bandwidth to do so. And if you're an entrepreneur, you need to do managing R&D, marketing, fundraising, etc. I do feel that finding the right partner with the right experience and the right track record and the chemistry with the entrepreneur, etc., could be beneficial to the venture. It should be cost effective, it should be in the right time, place, and with the right costs, just like any other supplier that you're hiring to do your PR, to do anything else that you do.
That's very good advice. It's whatever you outsource, make sure you're getting value for money there. Yep. Okay, I've got a number of other questions that are more generic, but what I'd quite like to do, and I'm sure that all our startups would also prefer, is for you to go walk us through maybe some of the key success factors that you know will make an impact on a crowdfunding campaign. You mentioned a list that you prepared.
Sure. So I'll send it. It would be more structured, but this is the top 5. First is understanding the and it's very general because we're starting with fundamental business or venturing issues, understanding the USP, understanding the competition, etc., and building a plan. Second is identify the target market, which is the most crucial one. It not just is generally speaking, it should be very, very specific about who is the typical backer that whether we approach a specific gender, geography, interests, income level, other social issue attributes, etc. Identify the target market will help us understand what should be the message, the story, what should be the media, the relevant media to tell so, because if you're approaching people with specific interests, it's better that we'll go for that bloggers that write on these issues and not only on general media, because we'd like to be cost effective in advertisements, etc., and to nail the right ones and not approaching ones that are not potential backers. Afterward, it's doing all the preparations needed, and you should allocate resources because, as I've said earlier, it's not an easy way to make money or to fundraise for money. You need to have a lot of efforts and focus and resources in order to do so. So preparing a Gantt chart, understanding the different roles, allocating at least one full-timer to do it for 4 or 5 months, because we have preparations, we have soft launch, we have the campaign itself, and we have the delivery. And the last is how to use the community during and post the campaign in order to leverage the assets that you gathered. Because when I'm speaking about crowd power, it's not only after you finish the campaign, now you're starting a new journey with them, but also during the campaign. And if we have 60 days, what would be the best ways in order to leverage this asset so we can have more and more backers? How can we turn them into ambassadors during the campaign? I think, I'm not sure that I mentioned 5, maybe it was a bit more, but these are the key issues. And of course, on the technical level, a good video, short to the point, which addresses both the team, because people invest in a team, they invest in an idea, how can it change the world, but also what can it do for them concretely, what's the value that they're getting. And of course, it's better that this video could hopefully become viral, and either it's humor, emotional, whatever technique is used, pushing it forward as a viral video could make the advertisement efforts or the spreading the word much easier. The good writings, texts, images that will describe it in a very attractive way and simple one. So these are the key elements.
I think the video is a really interesting point that you're making there. So you're saying that to go viral, whether you use emotional or humor as the technique, just make sure that it's a very, very good video that communicates the team, the idea, and the value that they're providing.
Yeah. Thank you for summarizing it in very intelligent way. I wish that I could do so as well.
No, I'm just using your words there, so being a bit of a parrot, but anyway. Okay, we've got 5 minutes left, so startups, you can please write in the chat any burning questions that you think we've left unanswered. I'm going to go with some of the more general questions that we had before going live with the chat. So, does crowdfunding need more regulation?
2010, when we published the first book, we had a chapter that started with a story that it's an absurd that you can take $100,000, put them in a suitcase, go to Vegas, burn them, spend them, enjoy them, whatever you'd like to say, come back with an empty suitcase, and that's legal. But taking $1,000 and investing in a local business is illegal and creating jobs, etc. Since then, I've done some progress in thinking and not only throwing tomatoes on policymakers, but also joining them in a way. And it's a debate whether you should keep small investors' money, or you think that they can decide for themselves. And I don't have a clear answer. I know that we should be balanced. I know that in some countries, a barrier of interest for startups or for platforms are too high, so the crowdfunding, equity-based crowdfunding does not exist. In other places, it's like the Wild West. And there should be balance, and the question is very generic because every country acts the same, differently. It's not the same for all the countries. I do think that we need checks and balances, and I do feel that in some cases it's too wild and we should protect small investors, but that's a debate I think that will last longer than the 60 or 100 seconds that are left.
It probably would, but it's probably also, Dan, I think we've lost you there. Dan?
Yep.
Ah, there you're back again. Okay, it's just the very last question. Is there anything that governments, is there anything governments or startup support organizations can do to promote crowdfunding in their local ecosystems?
So I think that market education should be number one. Most people would say that legal issues and financial, etc. I would say that still, unfortunately, crowdfunding is a niche, and the policymakers, the best that they can do is educate the market about the potential and give tools to entrepreneurs and to investors in order to evaluate properly and in order to fundraise properly. So education is number one.
And actually, one of the very last question here from EasyPonic: are the early adopters tired of crowdfunding? Is crowdfunding not as cool as it used to be?
Well, I'm biased. It's not it wouldn't be easy for me to answer. I think that crowdfunding, in a way, it's being mainstreamed, mainstreaming crowdfunding in the media and other ways. Whether it's still cool or not, I can't tell. But I can tell that having this lecture 6 or 7 years ago, and no one will know about crowdfunding in the audience. Today, as I'm having lectures to 50 or more people, it's not that I'm having one that already invested or backed in a project, but usually out of 50 people, one was fundraising via crowdfunding, whether for a non-profit or for-profit. So it's amazing to see that it's becoming very popular, and I'm very honored and blessed to be in such a time. Crowdfunding is becoming popular and maybe not as cool as it was before.
Well, I'm sure that you and your book have gone a long way to making this.
No.
I don't know whether cool, because I'm not really in that kind of arena still yet, but definitely a lot of people have benefited from all of your insights. So, Dan, thank you very much indeed for everything that you've shared with us today. Look forward to continuing to getting some of the tips, and that we can then spread them on to our 49 startup scale-uppers. And again, really look forward to seeing you actually in person sometime.
Likewise, and best of luck to you and for all the startups.
Thank you very much, Dan.